Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Galendez.
I'm Jennifer Domingue.
And we are Cannabis Legal Group. Welcome to episode 80 of Cannabis Live. Today we're going to talk about the new and emerging rules about temporary operators that occurred this past Wednesday at the board meeting. And we're kind of going to give a preview of the potential movement that's happening at the federal level that's happened more recently as of January 9th, I believe.
Yes.
A bill that was introduced to the House that could potentially eventually evolve into federal legalization. Fingers crossed for that one, but we definitely want to keep you up to date. Since our last Facebook Live last week, a lot of stuff has happened, even some things, I know we had talked about recalls, but another recall had just been released after that, so continue to watch us, like us on Facebook, share us, videos on YouTube. We like to try to stay as up to date as possible on all the latest news from the legislature and the regulators and the industry moving forward, because it continues to change. And it's just always a moving target, so it's just kind of interesting to keep up with how fast-paced the whole industry has been.
Absolutely. So along those same lines, in regards to the recalls, when we get a notice from the state, an advisory bulletin discussing a recall, of course it'll say where it was purchased, when the items were sold generally that were contaminated, and the strains and the batch numbers. We always post these to our Facebook. This way our subscribers can see that information, and make sure to check that out. We always post them, but I think that right now we're in a series of growing pains for the state, and so we're going to see some of these recalls until things start to stabilize a little bit within the industry. So right now, just keep an eye out on the state's website as well as on our Facebook page for those advisory bulletins.
Mm-hmm. And we did have the opportunity as a firm to go to Denver with Vicente Cedarberg and kind of attend educational session that was happening, and we always really appreciate doing that because we get to learn a little bit of insight onto how industries in more mature markets kind of grow and evolve. And I think one of the things we took from that just generally is the price per pound fluctuates. It reaches an equilibrium. And kind of to go along with that, as far as your budget projections and things go, is that, growing to scale, growing and adapting to certain different states' rules and regulations on pesticides and cultivation can lead to some differing results. So, one of the things we heard a lot more about kind of coming up was that, growers might be able to grow well here or at a smaller scale. It's one thing to be able to expand that to a massive, 1,500 plant or more grow, but it's another thing to do that in one state to another. So while one grower might have success in one state under those particular rules for testing, it might take some adjustment periods. And I think we're seeing that from the smaller scale caregivers right now, kind of forecasting for our next topic about temporary operators, but we're seeing product that's been grown to a certain quality get brought in, and while there's these recalls, I say they're all serious because we want to have safe and tested product across the board, but the reasons why they're being rejected and failing the tests could be a various, plethora of different reasons, which all go to safety, but definitely, kind of to emphasize the fact that, growing to scale is something that should be very well appreciated, to be consistent, to be compliant. And just, knowing where those markets, looking at more mature markets for those types of, told and true tales is very helpful and insightful.
Absolutely. We definitely got some good experience out of it, and we're looking forward to seeing how Michigan's market develops, much like our other states. In Colorado specifically, seeing how their market is evolving is definitely a good indication of how Michigan's market may evolve, and so it's always good to be on the cutting edge of that. In regards to some news that happened while we were in Denver, though, was that Lara recommended to the Medical Marijuana Licensing Board, or just the Marijuana Licensing Board now, that there should be an allowance for temporary operators to reopen and supply the state's patient base. I think that this is a good way for the patients of Michigan to be able to access their medical marijuana. If you look at the map, there was only one licensed provisioning center in the entire Upper Peninsula. And so that leaves a lot of possible patients without any access to their product other than a caregiver. And so at least allowing for these places to reopen temporarily through, I believe, March 31st, definitely gives the state a little bit of time to help, get some of these facilities licenses and create a more workable system.
Mm-hmm. And so it looks like we were a little, well, not too premature, because at that time, when we were on the show previously and said, rest in peace, temporary operators, that was completely true.
Yes.
At that time, it seems like due to the change in administration, potential different groups speaking out a little bit more strongly and their voices being heard, this was kind of a joint effort between, it had the governor's backing, the attorney general was on board. Laura decided to, kind of propose that the licensing board itself, recommend and adopt this resolution, allowing them to reopen. And so I think this is always that disclaimer part of the show where we say, what does this mean? It doesn't mean that you can just open up a facility if you've never been operating and kind of call yourself a temporary operator. There are those guidelines where you had to have applied and had, in a location that had an authorizing ordinance by December 15th of 2017. You needed to apply for your license and go through that process by February 15th, 2018. So that same group of temporary operators that we've been talking about for, a good year or so now are the ones that this resolution really affects. For everyone else that still was a little bit behind in that regard or wasn't open, you're still going to have to go through the arduous application process and take some time to do that. So, and what also this resolution doesn't say is that any of the conduct that's happening is necessarily, the way it's supposed to. Because we have the structure and the framework for a licensed grower to sell to a licensed processor, a provisioning center, for the secure transporters to move that product around and for it to be tested. And this resolution doesn't say that. It basically says for those temporary operators, as we have been treating it, if you open up, we're not going to hold that fact of you being open as an impediment to us granting you a license. So it's very careful to make sure that you don't misunderstand what this resolution says. Versus what it might be read to say, if you're not careful.
And we got a good question from Jay. Jay asked, can private caregivers supply overages to dispensaries? And one of the things that this recommendation does allow for is it does allow for provisioning centers to obtain product from a caregiver.
We're talking about licensed.
Licensed entities, licensed provisioning centers to obtain products from registered primary caregivers, and that will not be held against the licensed provisioning center. However, if you're going to do this, keep in mind that under the tenets of the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, which allows you to operate as a caregiver, you are not supposed to be making profit off of this caregiving activity. So while the licensed provisioning center, it will not be held against them for taking in that product, as an attorney, we do have to mention that technically that action, it does not say that there's going to be no consequence to the caregivers for engaging in that activity. So just take it with a grain of salt that while it is something that is possible, you'll have to weigh the risks and whether or not that's an activity you want to engage in.
Mm-hmm. And as far as what Jennifer was saying for the licensed provisioning centers, so it allows them to not have that conduct used against them if they bring product in from a caregiver or they purchase it from a temporary operating facility. What has to happen for that to follow this resolution, though, is that each time that's prior to it being sold, they need to sign the updated patient consent form that Laura just sent up a new version of that has what it was tested for, what it wasn't, a waiver from the patient, just that it hasn't been tested in full compliance with the rules. All the inventory, immediately upon receipt is going to have to be entered into metric. Of course, they're going to, as they would have to anyway, verify with a photo ID that the person is actually a patient. Enter all the sales into metric and make sure it doesn't exceed the daily or monthly purchasing limits, as well as the reporting requirements. I think that every temporary facility and fully licensed facility is going to have to do with notifying within 1 business day of any diversion, loss, theft, or adverse reactions to marijuana product. And so if you follow all of those guidelines, if you're a licensed provisioning center, you're allowed to bring those types of product in from those sources without any repercussions from the licensing board. And that's as far as this resolution goes.
Right, and the resolution is only good up until March 31st. So this is not just a free-for-all. There is a deadline, March 31st. And then the licensed provisioning centers can take in that product, as can licensed growers or processors. So you can also, there's going to be no adverse actions made against licensed growers or processors for taking in caregiver material as well. And they'll have to follow additional rules that are listed in the bulletin. And you can find that on the state's website as well.
And I think that kind of at least connects the dots between the previous resolution that was up there and that had been passed by the board saying, okay, these licensed provisioning centers can do this up through the end of December 31st, and then through January 31st, they have to do this. And then there was kind of nothing for February, nothing into March. And this at least gives some more clarity and guidance for the next few months as far as, what kind of category am I, what's applicable to me, and then what instructions am I expected to follow if I want to make sure I don't have any adverse reactions or decisions, against me as an operator, potential fines and citations for doing this and not following the actual instructions. So I think that's good. The more clarity, the more definitions we have, the more guidance, the better we all are as far as moving forward, especially when the laws and rules keep changing almost on a day-to-day basis, it seems.
Yes. And speaking of new laws, we do have a very exciting one to talk to you guys about. And it is something that was introduced on the federal level for the legalization of marijuana. It's called HR 420, and other than being a fan of just the name and number of it, it's formerly known as the Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol Act, and it was introduced by Representative Earl Blumenauer. So Representative Blumenauer has always been a very big proponent and advocate for the cannabis industry and trying to decriminalize and create a regulated industry. And we're really excited to see movement on this bill. It was introduced on January 9th. And so right now, it was just introduced. It's been sent out to multiple different committees on the federal congressional level. And so right now, keep in mind, we're going to be going over the specifics of this bill, but it's in the very, very early stages. And so, there's always the opportunity that it could be substantially amended, it could die entirely. So take everything what we say with, a little bit. It's not hard and fast. Like, this is definitely early on in the process. But that being said, it's pretty awesome, in my opinion, that we have a bill coming just after the 2018 Farm Bill. They're definitely on a pro-cannabis movement right now, or I'm hoping so, on the federal side. And so we're definitely hoping that this is something that gains traction. But that being said, let's kind of dive into the nitty-gritty.
And just as a, kind of a step back for 1 second, is that, this was introduced and then referred to various committees within the legislature. Once our government potentially gets back up and running, I would assume that there will be movement on that. So stay tuned for when that happens, if and when that happens. But it's still a work in progress, but there is momentum, from the industry, from the federal government, especially as Jennifer mentioned with the hemp bill being passed, the Farm Bill, hemp being legalized. There's definitely more momentum now, I think, than there ever has been within the industry. So that's definitely very exciting. I guess just, the overall broad sweeping point of this resolution, this introduced bill, is that it removes marijuana from all of the controlled substances schedule. So it would be basically descheduled, no longer considered a controlled substance at whatever schedule based on whether or not someone thinks it has medical benefit or addictive qualities to it. It'd be completely removed from that. And that would have a lot of different sweeping domino effects across all different kinds of federal law, which it also kind of, there's some language in here that reconciles all of that. So it takes marijuana out of the definition of a lot of different federal laws that touch various different categories all across the spectrum of the legal world, just to kind of harmonize all that and really reflect that change. And that would kind of open the doors to a lot of different things at the federal level as far as cannabis is concerned.
Absolutely. So that's obviously one of the biggest things that this bill does is it removes it as a Schedule I drug. It deschedulizes it completely. But another huge part of this bill is it creates for the possibility of a regulated industry such that it directs the Department of the Treasury to create a system where there's an application process to obtain permits or licenses, if you will. And so now the Department of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, can accept and review applications, and it can allow for these applicants to sell, process, grow, and all these ancillary functions as well. And so that's going to, I think, really, really open up the door, because the way that these permits work is it's if you want to do interstate commerce. And so we're really going to see a boom, if this should be passed, in interstate commerce of marijuana product. And that's very, very exciting.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking about this a little bit before the show. It does talk about how, it's not going to impose that on states that don't want it. So there's some language in there that says you can't ship or transport the product from a state or territory or location into a place if that place you're bringing it into, if you'd be violating those laws. What that really means, and there's certain legal potential arguments against a state completely banning marijuana where it would affect commerce across the, interstate commerce, where maybe Congress at the federal level has said things and has the not complete, but a substantial authority to direct commerce between the states. And it could be arguable that, a state, say Idaho, completely banning it after it's federally legal would run afoul of that particular clause in our Constitution. But at least right now, it's showing some appreciation or respect for, if a state or place isn't allowing it. Of course, the federal law is going to say we don't want to say it's okay for you to transport things into that state if the state doesn't want it.
Right.
So at least it's being respectful of that. As of right now, it has a charge of up to 1 year in imprisonment and fines if you were to do something like that. Right. And after going over that, we talked about it being descheduled, but it also eliminates penalties related to marijuana that would have fallen under the Controlled Substances Act pertaining to that. It also removes the complete prohibition on import and exports. I think one question is that if we're going to be protectionist of our industry, knowing that other countries have already been on board and are established, are we going to impose tariffs? Is there going to be some kind of trade agreements going on? Stay tuned for that. As we mentioned, this is very new. It's barely moved out of being introduced. But imports and exports would be allowed. It's just a question of, do we want to tax those Canadian products coming in since they're a lot more evolved than us?
Right.
Same thing with Denver, Colorado, and California, more mature markets. Do we want to protect our state? Do we want to protect our country or our industry within the country? So that'll be things that they'll have to kind of hash out if and when they review this and it gets out of committee and gets voted on by both sides of the House.
Another thing that we talked about briefly or a little bit earlier was the fact that the Department of the Treasury has been directed to create this application. There are a couple of prohibited things that will restrict certain applicants from seeking licensure. While we don't have a draft of what an application would look like, there are a couple of things that the bill specifically prohibits, such as a felony in the last 5 years or a misdemeanor in the last 3 years. So we do have that review of a criminal background and having that as a very integral part of the application process and review and determination on whether or not to grant a license. And because this is an administrative policy, if you are denied a license, then of course you can't appeal it. There is going to be an administrative law judge that will have a hearing and determine make a recommendation on whether or not there should be a license awarded or not. But that is certainly an option there. So because it is under the Department of the Treasury, it's subject to all of the administrative laws that go along with that.
And kind of to close off the talk about this bill, HR 420, it kind of touches very lightly on the application process, on the criteria for ineligibility. It talks about, if you want to potentially transfer this permit that was issued by the Department of Treasury. And then what it also does is kind of similar to harmonizing those different laws. It also opens up and adds to a lot of other different laws, the Wilson Act, the Webb Canyon Act, Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, presumably to flip the language in there from marijuana is bad, these are things that if this person is doing under these laws, they aren't eligible for or disqualifies them for. Kind of acknowledging that it would be legal federally. It's kind of adding those in there as maybe a non-issue anymore, and just kind of reconciling that potential change within all these different laws. I think primarily the concern or the focus of what the industry should be thinking about, though, is the FDA would have the same power to regulate, labeling and different, regulations as it pertains to cannabis as it does for alcohol. The jurisdiction pertaining to cannabis would move from the DEA to the newly named, if this does pass, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Marijuana, Firearms, and Explosives. And it would also have a little bit of an effect on, having deceptive ads, misleading ads about cannabis. So it definitely kind of, takes a lot of things out of federal laws that might no longer apply to the substance, acknowledging that if this does pass, it would be legal at the federal level. It also adds the word in to a bunch of other places to allow for more control over it, to treat it, instead of it being illegal as something such as alcohol that would be regulated and it's subject to several other, tens if not hundreds of other different laws under federal law that you would then have to comply with and know a lot about going forward. So it will definitely create a lot more different pathways and laws that will intersect with one another, but it also creates a lot more opportunities and, I think would legalize something that the majority of Americans believe should be legalized and not treated like radioactive waste. So.
Absolutely, but that in a nutshell is HR 420. And you better believe we'll be updating you on the progress of this bill. When we get more news, of course, we'll be updating you as well on that. So if you have any questions, feel free to comment, and we'll try to get back to you in the comment section and answer some of your questions. And we'll look forward to talking with you next week.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.